Good day, Social 300. My name's Gavin, this is Nikki, and we're here today to talk to you about prisoner reintegration. Treatment is like fixing the car, but leaving rocks in the road. We have seen a shift from the welfare state to the punitive state when describing the contemporary context of prisoner reintegration. There are approximately 40,000 Canadians in custody on any given day, and roughly 95% of all prisoners get out and return to the community. However, about 68% of these individuals will reoffend. We sought to understand why this was occurring, why recidivism was happening, and what issues were prevalent in preventing a smooth prisoner reintegration practice.
Our focus of this TED Talk is around structural stigmatization and the issues it imposes. We will discuss the issues of a criminal record, psychological effects, and how intersectionality can affect a structural stigmatization. Lastly, we will discuss the issue of schedule as a relevant example to our issue and potential solutions we feel can be implemented to improve a smoother reintegration for ex-convicts. So, what is structural stigma? Structural stigma is when stigma is systematically applied by agencies, institutions, and individuals to a particular group of people or population as a whole. So, moving beyond stigma as a perception of an individual attribute to a wider, stereotypical concept of stigma that taints an entire group and pushes them to the margins of the society.
So, how does a criminal record affect an ex-convict's chances of finding a job? Well, the repercussions of prison and the stigma it carries does not disappear once they've left that lifestyle. In fact, anyone who's convicted under the Criminal Code of Canada receives a criminal record which contributes to the manifestations of the stigma of being an ex-convict. It stays with you for a long time, 80 years to be exact. However, there are a few exceptions to get rid of a criminal record, such as an absolute discharge, a conditional discharge, and non-convictions, to name a few. The manifestations of this stigma creates a vast amount of problems, ensuring that reintegration will be difficult, creating another punishment within itself. When trying to find employment to support themselves, they will encounter failure, as employers do not hire anyone with a conviction. Furthermore, even volunteer organizations have started to ask for a criminal record check, which creates an additional barrier. The criminal record check does not stop stigmatization there. Certain fields of education require a clean criminal record as well. This serves to further limit their areas of growth. Although you may be qualified for the job, you are still an ex-convict to a future employer. The fact is that ex-prisoners do not have the ability to choose to not disclose that information that stigmatizes them. This is the example of structural stigmatization. The system forces them to admit that they're an ex-convict. And without a stable job, that means a lack of stable income, meaning bills would be hard to pay. For example, if you are able to rent a place, affording the rent is the difference between having a shelter of your own and being homeless. In fact, approximately 25% of prisoners in the US experience homelessness within the first year of being released. Essentially, the inevitable will occur in which one would face so much strain that they would eventually turn back to crime as a means of self-support. To conclude, the stigmatization of a criminal record works to ensure ex-convicts face yet another punishment once they are reintegrated back into society. However, due to the repercussions of a criminal record that were aforementioned, individuals may not be properly reintegrated, and with social exclusion and discrimination, they can be marginalized and eventually be pushed back towards a life of crime as a means of self-support.
So, as discussed before, stigmatization has major effects on people, especially those belonging to minority races. It leads to labeling, and once a person is labeled, it can carry severe psychological effects. Being stigmatized has adverse psychological effects. Society categorizes individuals and attaches normal attributes to such categories. According to Goffman, stigma occurs in individual interactions. It occurs when certain attributes make an individual different than others, and that attribute has a discrediting effect. The discriminatory behavior that results from the discovery of this attribute is observable evidence of stigma. Stigma creates a power imbalance in interactions. Now, if you look at ex-convicts, millions of them are experiencing loss of civil rights. It affects civic and communal participation. As a result, they feel alienated from communities and, of course, the political process. Well, it creates political incentives to punish certain groups. Wow. More medical and mental health problems occur. That compared to the general population, such people tend to occur more medical and mental health problems. And also, to make matters worse, their lack of mental health resources available to ex-convicts. And these male convicts, these ex-convicts are mostly male minorities, and they have been to prison several times before. According to the research, they also have history of drug and alcohol abuse. Now, these factors that I discussed as a result contribute to the psychological deterioration of the person, as not much hope is left for the person to have a normal life. Therefore, there's a strong need for the criminal justice system to offer more incentives to the prisoners for not committing crimes again and lower the recidivism rates. There needs to be development in the offender reformation programs, as they need to be provided employment opportunities as a second chance. As realistically, they have a very little chance of getting hired or employed. Such people are left with no choice and resort to committing crimes again. This is how recidivism rates rise. We stress that it is extremely important to have a good social network, of course, and to maintain a positive relationship with the police officer or the parole officer during your time in jail. It really helps in future assistance and, of course, your job referral. Furthermore, to briefly touch upon intersectionality, when these prisoners are newly integrated back into the society, they face unavoidable stigma. This is the result of the intersection of various identities. Number one, we have ex-criminal. Number two, that the race of the person, whether the person is black or Latino, for example. Also, the gender of the person is very important because women face double stigma, not for only committing a crime and being an ex-convict, but also for breaking the gender norms, as such a behavior is not really expected of women. Number four is the socioeconomic status, or the power and privileges enjoyed by the person. Well, together, they play a role in defining an individual's status in a society. For example, in the reading which we did in class, Black Latino boys in the neighborhood, it shows how regularly such people belonging to such race categories are policed so regularly, regardless of them even committing a crime. Now, as a result, the situation tends to get much worse because they belong to this race and also they're ex-convicts now. They're kind of living up to the stereotype placed on them by people in the society.
The Skid Row reading mentions the lives and experiences of ex-convicts and how they navigated through the aftermath of the socio-economic impacts of incarceration and the long-term impacts it had on their reintegration. They were subjected to implicit bias and presumption of guilt when in contact with police due to the stigma of living in Skid Row. However, they lived there due to their socio-economic group. Skid Row carried a territorial stigma. due to the residents that occupied the space at the time. Residing in Skid Row subjected oneself to a place that intersects with other stigmas, stigmas that are commonly associated with extreme poverty, race, and a criminal record. This caused residents to experience tensions between their internal self-perceptions and the imposed identities that were given to them by society. Furthermore, the stigma of their housing situation employed the territorial stigma that subjected them to poor interactions with the police. They lived within a stigmatized area which fostered a suspicion of deviance, if not outright guilty. This meant that the police were patrolling these areas with the mentality of individuals being up to no good, again, related to the stigma of poor housing, such as where ex-convicts would occupy that space. In fact, this has been noticed in academia. Hyper-policing amplifies what scholars of urban poverty theorize as an increasing fusion of ghetto and prison culture. Thus, we can see that there's a correlation between where they live and prison culture, further stigmatizing these ex-convicts. That concludes our TED Talk. To reiterate, we mentioned how prisoners face structural stigmatization and how that is manifested through the criminal record. Also, mentioning the repercussions of having a criminal record. Furthermore, the psychological effects of being stigmatized as an ex-convict and the need for a stronger support system to better reintegrate ex-convicts, as previously discussed.
And lastly, we briefly touched upon intersectionality and how Skid Row showed us a modern example of this structural stigmatization that ex-convicts faced. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope that we have educated you all on the implications that ex-convicts face through structural stigmatization. Thank you very much.
Yeah! Okay. We are finito.